that great of sources for the life of Jesus, for pretty much anything from that time period regarding him. Even the Gospels were written a good deal afterwards. Isn't that maybe where the arrogance lies, in claiming that your truth claim is more valid than other truth claims, especially when most of our evidence points to the contrary?
Okay. What's the gap between when Jesus lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead, and the first documents that were written?
17 years.
The gap is about 20 to 60 years. So you've got Paul writing Galatians and Philippians and 1st and 2nd Corinthians in the late 40s, early 50s, mid 50s, late 50s AD. So that's 20 to 30 years after the events. Ma'am, there is nothing from antiquity that even comes close to that kind of gap. The gap between the events that Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote about is hundreds of years.
That's true, but we don't take what Herodotus said at face value. A lot of Herodotus is actually just literature that we take and go, oh, that's interesting, but don't really glean history from.
Yeah, and Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. Good history.
Again, we don't place unlimited faith in those writings, though. It just seems odd to me when you approach something like the Gospels that are no more reliable than something like Herodotus, that you would ask people to place absolute faith in something infallible.
No, none of us has absolute faith. Who here has absolute faith? All of us struggle with doubt. Nobody has absolute faith. I've never met anybody who has absolute faith. It's a question of what does the evidence point to? And the evidence clearly points to the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. And it's based on the Gospel's historical reliability. Now, how do you determine historicity? For myself, I've got 4 tests. If you don't like my 4 tests, no problem. Come up with your own tests. But just be consistent as you look at all of history. My 4 tests are internal consistency, literary style, archaeological evidence, and manuscript evidence. First test, internal consistency, meaning by that, are there contradictions within the text that point to massive confusion on the part of the authors? No. When you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll discover a tremendous internal harmony. Consistency. Second test, literary style. Is the literary style of the document once upon a time in the land of Nod, Wynken, Blynken, and Odd took a boat ride? Well, that's obviously fairy tale, once upon a time. No, the Gospels are not once upon a time. The Gospels are, at this time, in this place, with these people around, Jesus said this, he did that. It reads like the New York Times, the LA Times. It's clearly historical narrative. That's the literary genre. Third test, archaeology. Are we talking about Jesus being born in the island of Atlantis and playing with Mickey Mouse and Elmer Fudd? No. The Gospels talk about him being born in Bethlehem, growing up in Nazareth, at the time of Tiberius Caesar. Archaeologically verifiable places and rulers. Fourth test. Today, the New Testament in English is based on over 5,000 Greek manuscripts or pieces of manuscript, dated from the 2nd through the 10th century AD, all agreeing to an infinitesimal degree. So it's obvious that we have what the eyewitnesses wrote. Now, what gives us any degree of certainty that what they wrote is the truth? Well, what convinces that for me is they died for what they claimed to have seen. The eyewitnesses who saw Christ risen from the dead died for what they claimed to have seen. That gives their claim a tremendous amount of credibility.
A lot of people die for what they claim to have seen, though. I mean,
Really, give me one example.
Well, just off the top of my head, there's another Jewish Messiah in the 15th century, Shabtai Tzvi. Excuse me, that's not the example that I'd like to use.
Oh, I have a great example here.
Do you? Well, please jump in, Mike.
Well, according to the Shiran Peace Museum, 1,036 Japanese kamikaze pilots died in the World War II. Now, Are you believing that their beliefs were true because they were willing to die for them?
No, that's not what I said. What I said was the eyewitnesses who saw Christ risen from the dead were willing to die, not for a belief. They were willing to die for what they claimed to have seen. The dead Christ risen from the dead.
Okay, who are these eyewitnesses?
These eyewitnesses were James, Peter, John, Matthew, Thaddeus.
They're paraphrasing earlier works. They're paraphrasing Paul, and Paul wasn't around Jesus during Jesus' life. He came later.
John, Matthew, Thaddeus, Peter, all saw Christ risen from the dead.
Repeating yourself is not going to make it true.
Repeating yourself is not going to make it true either. You're absolutely right.
The fact is, history's on my side with this.
No, sir. Eyewitnesses, Peter, Matthew, James, John, saw Christ risen from the dead, and they were willing to die for what they'd seen.
According to Paul, they're just copying what he wrote.
No, the Gospel of Matthew, 1st and 2nd Peter, James. Clearly, these guys
based on Mark and Paul. These are secondary accounts. There are no contemporary accounts. None of these
James is an eyewitness, sir. He was a younger brother of Christ.
According to another person, this is a secondary account.
No, James wrote the letter of James in the New Testament. It wasn't written by Paul. It was written by James. Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, Clement, Bishop of Rome, clearly talk about Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. They quote him.
Yeah, they quote.
They quote the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah, they quote the document.
Yeah.
It's a second-hand account. That's hearsay.
It's not a second-hand account. Matthew was an eyewitness. Matthew saw Christ, saw him risen from the dead, and he died for what he claimed to have seen.
I'm just going off. I'm not an expert in the Bible. I'm just going off of what the best scholars in the field are going.
Sir, I can promise you can find many New Testament scholars who disagree strongly with each other, obviously. So that's why you can't just listen to them. You have to go back and study the source documents. You got to go back and study Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then you got to read the writings of the early church fathers, like Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, Clement, Bishop of Rome, Papias, Polycarp, Eusebius. You've got to study their writings.
Oh, let's see. Felix Phlegon is one of those sources, because these are all written pretty much at least a century later, with the exception of Paul.
Sir, how could the Gospel of Matthew have been written a century later if in 95 AD Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, quotes Matthew? You're leaning on old scholarship.
Okay, so there's two that are within a century. That's not very strong evidence.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written within the first century. Jesus died around 33 AD. They are written within 60 years of his death.
It has to be.
They're within the first century.
Apparently we have something. Gosh, that's old information. 70 is our terminus postquam. It has to be written after 70 because the destruction of the temple is referenced. So,
why does it have to be written after the destruction of the temple?
Because it references the destruction of the temple.
Right, but notice what that's doing. What you're doing is you have a
to
presupposition.
but-
You have a philosophical presupposition that says there is no such thing as prophecy, the ability to see the future. Therefore, for Jesus to say that the temple will be destroyed has to be written after 70 AD when it was destroyed. And that's obviously due to your philosophical presupposition of naturalism.
And the philosophical presupposition of everybody who studies history.
Yeah, is that not the default position that miracles don't have to be proven?
Wait a second. April 1865. Wasn't that when Lincoln was assassinated?
Correct.
All right. So if you read a life of Abraham Lincoln that does not include his assassination, don't you think it's wise to conclude that was written before April 1865? Because if I'm writing a biography on Abraham Lincoln and I exclude his assassination, his death, what's that all about? The evidence points to I wrote it before his assassination. Now, you've got the book of Acts that does not record the main character's death, the Apostle Paul. Therefore, it would be very wise to say, hey, the evidence is Acts was written before the Apostle Paul was beheaded. It was written before 68 AD or 69 AD. So you're right. The Gospels do not record the destruction of Jerusalem, do they? That is why it's wise to say, gosh, they were written before 70 AD.
They do reference it. That's the point.
No, they do not. They have Jesus making a prediction that the temple will be destroyed. But there is no record in the Gospels of the temple being destroyed.
His body will be destroyed and then raised in 3 days. And then the Gospels later attribute this to the destruction of the temple, which they assumed he was making. That point is obviously a later attribution. Jesus says nothing about the destruction of the temple. He says his own body will be destroyed.
Yeah, that's a later interpretation.
Yeah,
That's not true.
I mean,
in Matthew chapter 24, in Mark chapter 13, and in Luke chapter 21, Jesus answers the disciples' question, hey, what's going to happen in this temple? And he clearly says it's going to be knocked down, not one stone will be on top of the other. And that's exactly what happened in 70 AD when the Romans came in and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. But it was a prediction he was making. If your philosophical principle tells you that abusing children is wrong, but if my philosophical principle teaches me that abusing children is good, where do you get off telling me that I'm wrong and that you're right?
By analyzing the outcomes of those things.
Yeah, and if I analyze the outcome as abusing children is good, what makes you right and what makes me wrong?
We all have to come to the consensus.
All right, and if the consensus of Nazi Germany is that we're to gas Jews, where do you get off telling Nazis that they're wrong in gassing Jews?
Well, I certainly wouldn't look to the Bible because God ordered genocide before. So even he has to have morals he's going to, that he apparently violated a few times against the Canaanites.
Now answer the question.
Where do I?
What is the basis for you saying that gassing Jews is wrong?
My natural empathy towards Jewish people and people.
Your natural empathy, but that means it's relative, right?
Yeah.
And if I have a natural empathy as a Nazi to gas Jews, what makes me wrong and you right? Pardon?
Because I came to that conclusion through rational analysis. I mean, the Nazis burnt their documents. They knew what they were doing was wrong. They wouldn't claim to be doing the right thing. In fact, a lot of them were claiming they were doing the bad thing for a greater good. But they consciously acknowledged by burning their evidence that they knew what they were doing was wrong. That's a very bad analogy.
No, it's a perfect analogy, because you see, once again, you said they knew what they were doing was really wrong. Who defines really wrong?
We all.
We all do.
Yeah.
Really? Like the white Americans who enslaved black Americans, they really knew. Like the Nazis who gassed Jews, they really knew.
And when those philosophies are put under scrutiny by the population as a whole, they're rejected.
Okay, then if we have this moral sense that certain things are right and wrong, then it means that there are objective morals that we really know.
No, they're just morals that we agree on.
No, we don't agree, sir. Come on now, you know that. We don't agree.
Well, if they're objective, and you're saying they come from God, right?
They're objective.
Then how come God violates them if he's supposed to be perfectly...
He doesn't violate them. We'll get into that, don't worry.
All right, Genesis, we'll move that on. Yeah. All right, we'll move on.
No, we're not moving on. We're staying in the kitchen. I know it's getting hot, but we'll stay in the kitchen.
We'll go on to that later.
No, that's the next one. We'll get to there, don't worry.
All right.
But let's be logical in our progression here. And the point we're at is, does objective morality exist or does it not? I think you and I agree it does.
No, I would say...
Because you said wrong. That's really wrong. As if that's objectively wrong, right?
It's by my understanding of it.
Yeah, okay. Now, just ask you to think. How can there be an objective moral wrong?
I just said that I didn't believe there was an objective one.
Yes, you do. You've sat here and said, the gassing of Jews is really wrong. I heard you say it.
By my understanding of ethics, yeah.
Okay, but then, no, if you're going to be consistent with your relativism, you're going to have to say it's wrong from my perspective, but not from their perspective.
And so we put them together and we analyze both of them, and the outcomes for one of them is clearly negative.
See, that's why I can't be an atheist. The reason I cannot be an atheist is because I can't live it out. And guess what? None of my atheist friends live out their atheism consistently. They all do exactly what you and I have just done. They all say, when Latrell Sprewell choked his coaches by the neck in basketball practice, that was really wrong. When white Christian racists enslaved African Americans, that was really wrong. When Nazis gassed Jews, that was really wrong. You see, we all live, not as if morality is relative, we all live as if there are, maybe not many, but at least a few, objective morals. When is bashing a homosexual ever good?
I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there could always be some, crazy cartoony reason.
Good, it'd be crazy, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Bashing homosexuals is never good. Bashing heterosexuals is never good. Bashing bisexuals is never good. Bashing people is never good. Well, that's an objective moral.
What if the person's going to hurt themselves and the only way you can stop them is by tackling them?
That's not bashing them. That's protecting them.
Protecting them. All right.
That's right.
That is
Big
subjective.
difference. That's protecting them.
Wait, so that's not subjective if it's...
Oh, yes, there's a lot of subjectivity in morality. I didn't say every moral issue involves an absolute. Never said that.
Oh.
There's a lot of relativism in ethics. But there are at least a few moral absolutes.
Well, how do you know they're absolute and just not very widely agreed upon to the point it's essentially absolute?
Because you can't live your life as a moral relativist by saying, no, I realize this is just my opinion or just the consensus of the majority in my culture. You say, no, Nazism, gassing Jews, even though I'm not a Nazi, I'm not from that culture, I'm outside that culture, I still have a conscience and my moral experience teaches me objective wrong, gassing Jews. Objective wrong. Not subjective. Not my personal opinion is you're naughty if you gas Jews. Not subjective, personal opinion. Like, I prefer broccoli to beans.
So what is your conception of hell? Like, what is that to you? Because I know there are a lot of different, there are some that say it's just a separation from God. Others, it's more, torturing. So what's your personal opinion?
Obviously, the New Testament and Jesus talk about hell as separation from God. Jesus says, you will be told, depart from me, you who practice lawlessness, in Matthew chapter 7. So, it's obviously separation from God, which means it's separation from the giver of all the good gifts that we enjoy today. Second point, obviously Jesus used some of the most horrible human language imaginable to describe hell. Third point, obviously, he points out that hell exists because God is good. And because God is good, he cannot allow evil to triumph. If there is no hell, if there is no day of judgment, evil wins. Too often, too frequently.
So in your opinion, it's, going off of what your understanding of it, what is it to you? What do you believe it is?
It's incredible separation from God. It's separation from all the good gifts that he has given us to enjoy. It's a guarantee that evil will ultimately lose and that goodness and justice and compassion will ultimately triumph.
But is it like suffering? Is it like torture? Or is it just absence?
Jesus doesn't answer that question. Why? Because he says in Matthew chapter 25 that hell was prepared for the devil and his demons. Well, the devil and his demons are not physical corporal bodies. They're spiritual beings. So in light of the fact that hell was prepared for non-physical spiritual beings initially, what exactly is the physical component of hell? I do not know. Jesus never answers the question. The New Testament also talks about hell as fire and burning, also talks about hell as outer darkness. Well, you've got fire and burning, you got outer darkness. If you don't watch out, you're going to set up a real contradiction there. Obviously, you can't have both of those at the same time in the same place. But obviously, when you read those passages in context, they are not specific photographs that Jesus is giving us of hell. But obviously what he's doing is he's using some of the most horrible human language imaginable to describe hell.
So likewise, heaven wouldn't be defined as like just a paradise with everything's good. It's just being with God. I'm guessing.
Heaven is not Tucson, Arizona. As beautiful as Tucson is, right?
I think it's heaven, guys. I've been to Phoenix.
So, yes, you're right. We don't know the physical dimensions of heaven. When you take the book of Revelation, you've got to interpret it very carefully. Why? Because it's apocalyptic literature, highly symbolic literature. And if you try and take photographs in the book of Revelation, I think you're making a big mistake. You're not respecting literary genre, literary style.
So is it possible to be unhappy in heaven?
You'll be in the presence of God who you love, and it will be joy. There'll be no more suffering, no more death. It will be incredible.